When I came home that evening, something felt off right away. The house was too quiet, except for the faint clink of a glass coming from the living room. As I stepped inside, the smell of stale wine hit me. I found Laura sprawled on the couch, her hair a mess, mascara streaked down her face. An empty bottle sat on the coffee table next to her phone, which buzzed every few seconds with notifications. "James," she slurred, sitting up with difficulty when she noticed me. "You're early." I stared at her, confused and concerned. "Laura, what's going on? Are you okay?" She laughed, but it came out hollow and bitter. "No, I'm not okay. I'm a mess, James. I've done something terrible." My stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" She looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of her glass. "I slept with someone else. My boss, Greg." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stood there, frozen, as her confession unraveled my world. "Why?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "I don't know. It just happened. Things between us have been so dull lately. I needed something more dull." That's how she described our life together. I thought about the years we'd spent building a home, supporting each other through challenges. Had it all been so meaningless to her? "You needed something more, so you betrayed me?" My voice rose, anger replacing the shock. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated before mumbling, "A few months. A few months." Months of lies, of her coming home late with excuses about work. Months of me trusting her, loving her, while she was. I couldn't even finish the thought. "I didn't mean to hurt you, James," she added, as though that made it any better. "It just happened." I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the stranger in front of me. "You didn't mean to hurt me? Laura, you destroyed me." For a moment, she looked remorseful, but then her expression hardened. "Well, maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have looked elsewhere. That broke something in me. Any hope I had that this was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, vanished." She wasn't sorry. She wasn't apologizing. She was blaming me. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and left, the sound of her crying behind me doing nothing to soften the storm raging inside me. That night, I didn't sleep. I drove aimlessly around town, the headlights cutting through the darkness while my thoughts spun out of control. Every moment of our marriage replayed in my mind like a cruel movie. The vacations, the inside jokes, the nights we spent talking about our future, it all felt tainted now. A lie. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, I found myself parked in front of the diner where we used to have breakfast every Sunday. It used to be our spot. Now, it felt like just another reminder of what I'd lost. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. When I got home, Laura was in the kitchen. She'd cleaned herself up, and for a moment, it almost looked like nothing had happened. But then she turned to me, her face drawn with tension. "Can we talk?" I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to walk past her, pack a bag, and leave. But instead, I nodded and sat down at the table, folding my arms across my chest. "Go ahead." She wrung her hands, her voice trembling as she began. "I'm sorry for what I said last night. I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it, Laura?" I asked coldly. "Because it sounded a lot like you were blaming me for your affair." Her eyes darted away, and for a second, I thought she might actually admit she was wrong. But instead she said, I felt so alone, James. You've been so busy lately. Work, the house projects. You barely even looked at me anymore." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to sleep with your boss?" "It wasn't like that," she snapped, her voice rising. "Greg and we connected. He listened to me. He made me feel." "Don't you dare say he made you feel loved," I cut in, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "You don't betray someone you love." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she sat there, staring at me like I was supposed to understand, to forgive her. But all I felt was anger. Anger and something worse. Disappointment. "I want the truth, Laura," I said after a long silence. "No more excuses, no more blaming me. How long has this been going on? How many times?" She hesitated, and I could see her weighing how much to admit. "For months," she said finally. "It started at the company retreat." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "And you didn't think to tell me? To stop it before it got this far?" "I tried," she insisted, tears pooling in her eyes. "But it was complicated. Greg, he's my boss, James. I couldn't just end things without making work unbearable." I let out a bitter laugh. "So you chose your comfort over our marriage. Good to know where your priorities are." Her tears started falling then, but they didn't move me. "Not this time." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I've hurt you, but I still love you, James. We can fix this. We can go to counseling." "No," I interrupted, standing up. "We can't fix this. You made sure of that the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." I walked out before she could say anything else, heading to the spare bedroom and locking the door behind me. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, one thing became clear. I couldn't stay in this marriage. Not after what she'd done. The next morning, I started making calls, first to a lawyer, then to a real estate agent. If Laura wanted to break us, then I'd make sure she understood exactly what that meant. The days that followed were a haze of numbness and calculation. I moved through my routines like a ghost, eating only when my body reminded me, sleeping only when exhaustion dragged me under. My mind, however, was relentless. Every quiet moment was filled with the echoes of Laura's betrayal. The way she had confessed, the excuses she had made, it gnawed at me. I needed answers, and I needed clarity. I started piecing things together. Her late nights, the unexplained business trips, the sudden uptick in her wardrobe spending. It was all right there in hindsight. It was infuriating how obvious it seemed now, but in the moment, I had been blind, trusting. Love does that to you, I suppose. It makes you see what you want to see, even when the truth is hiding in plain sight. Laura went through the motions, pretending things were fine, but I could feel the cracks widening between us. She wasn't remorseful. Not really. Her apologies felt hollow, as though she was more upset about being caught than about what she had done. She avoided me unless it was necessary, which suited me just fine. The less I saw of her, the easier it was to keep my anger under control. I began digging deeper, not because I wanted to hurt myself further, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I combed through her emails, checked phone records, even sifted through receipts she'd carelessly left in drawers. The truth revealed itself piece by piece. The affair wasn't a single mistake or moment of weakness. It had been premeditated, deliberate, and ongoing. She had lied to me over and over, every time she came home late or left town for work. There were messages between her and Greg, the kind that made my stomach churn. They talked about meeting up, about their feelings, about things I wish I could unsee. The way she spoke to him, with warmth and excitement, was a stark contrast to the coldness she'd shown me in those final months before the confession. It was as if I had been living with a stranger, someone capable of hiding an entire life from me while smiling across the dinner table. The worst discovery wasn't the messages or the receipts. It was finding out that her colleagues likely knew about the affair. The thought of other people seeing what was going on behind my back, pitying me or laughing at my obliviousness, made my blood boil. My humiliation wasn't just private. It was public. She hadn't just betrayed me, she'd made a mockery of our marriage. I didn't confront her about what I found. There was no point. Laura had shown her true colors, and I knew anything she said would be just another lie. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I started documenting everything. Every message, every receipt, every clue I uncovered was saved and stored. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about protecting myself, about making sure that when the dust settled, I wouldn't be the one left shattered and powerless. I realized that the man I had been before all this, the trusting husband, the man who believed in love and loyalty, was gone. In his place was someone colder, sharper, and infinitely more cautious. The pain of betrayal had carved something new into me, and I wasn't sure I liked what I was becoming. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Laura or Greg walk away from this unscathed. As the days turned into weeks, my grief began to harden into something else, something darker. Anger wasn't a strong enough word for it. It wasn't just Laura's betrayal that haunted me, it was the sheer audacity of it all. She had destroyed the foundation of our life together, and yet, she walked around like she could move past it unscathed. She had no intention of facing consequences. That realization fueled the fire inside me. I spent my evenings meticulously planning. It started with research, what steps I needed to take to separate myself from her financially and legally. Every bank account, every investment, every joint asset was scrutinized. I quietly met with a divorce lawyer, laying out the situation in full detail. My lawyer, a sharp and composed woman, encouraged me to gather as much evidence as possible to strengthen my case. I didn't need to be told twice. With each piece of evidence I compiled, I felt a sense of control returning. The screenshots of text messages, the emails, the receipts, the proof of their weekend trips, it was all there, a mountain of irrefutable evidence. But it wasn't enough to just protect myself. I wanted them both to feel the weight of what they'd done. I didn't want to burn bridges. I wanted to burn their entire world down. Laura's boss, Greg, wasn't just any man. He was a well-respected figure in his company, a family man with a carefully cultivated reputation. It disgusted me how someone like that could sit in boardrooms making decisions while simultaneously tearing apart his own family, and mine. I began researching him, too. Social media profiles, LinkedIn connections, and even company press releases became part of my arsenal. He had much to lose, and I planned to ensure he lost it. I decided to bide my time. Confronting them now would only give them a chance to spin the narrative in their favor. Instead, I waited, watching as they carried on with their lives, oblivious to the storm I was preparing. Laura continued her half-hearted attempts at reconciliation, but it was obvious she wasn't putting in any real effort. She avoided difficult conversations, clung to the excuse that she had been unhappy, and never once showed the kind of remorse you'd expect from someone who truly wanted to fix things. Her indifference only pushed me further. I reached out to a trusted IT-savvy friend and asked for advice on securing digital records. Within days, I had copies of everything. Laura's phone records, Greg's emails, and even messages sent through supposedly private apps. It was all there in black and white. The lies, the scheming, the utter disregard for anyone but themselves. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became. I also started preparing for what came after. Revenge wasn't going to fix me or erase the betrayal, but it would give me the closure I needed to move on. I began taking steps to secure my own future. Separate bank accounts, a new apartment scoped out for when I left, and reconnecting with old friends I'd distanced myself from during my marriage. These small victories felt like tiny cracks of light in the darkness. The final piece of my plan was set in motion one afternoon when I anonymously emailed a selection of the more incriminating messages to Greg's company's HR department. I didn't need to spell out the situation. The evidence spoke for itself. I knew this would trigger an internal investigation, one that would force Greg to face the consequences of his actions. The fallout would ripple, affecting Laura as well. It was only a matter of time. With every step I took, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. The man I had been, the one who loved unconditionally, who trusted blindly, was gone. In his place was someone calculating, cold, and driven by a need for justice. Or maybe it wasn't justice. Maybe it was revenge. At that point, I didn't care about the distinction. I only knew that I wouldn't stop until they both paid for what they had done. The day everything began to unravel for Laura and Greg felt almost surreal. I'd waited weeks, methodically putting all the pieces in place, ensuring the fallout would be as devastating as their betrayal deserved. It was no longer about just hurting them, it was about exposing them for who they really were, to the people who thought they knew them. The first domino fell when Greg's company launched an internal investigation. The email I had sent, along with the attached evidence, left no room for misinterpretation. The messages were explicit, not just in their romantic nature but also in how they openly discussed sneaking away during company events and abusing their positions to cover their tracks. For a man in Greg's position, this wasn't just a personal scandal. It was a professional disaster. Word spread quickly within his office. I'd been strategic about timing, ensuring the evidence landed during a critical period. A quarterly review, when tensions were already high and reputations were under scrutiny. From what I later heard through mutual acquaintances, the atmosphere at Greg's office turned toxic overnight. He became the subject of whispered conversations, sideways glances, and barely disguised contempt. By the time HR formally confronted him, the damage to his credibility was irreparable. For Laura, the fallout was more personal but no less devastating. I'd made sure to include evidence that implicated her just as much as Greg. Their colleagues weren't blind to the signs, the unexplained absences, the flirtatious exchanges during meetings, but seeing it laid bare in writing was something else entirely. Her co-workers, many of whom she had considered friends, began distancing themselves. The looks of pity and judgment she endured were only the beginning. I didn't attend the confrontation itself, but I knew when it happened. Laura came home that evening pale and tense, her eyes darting nervously as she avoided my gaze. She didn't tell me what had happened, of course. She hadn't confided in me for months, and this was no exception. But her demeanor spoke volumes. She looked like someone who had been cornered, exposed, and left with nowhere to hide. The next day, I received a text from an old friend of mine who worked in the same industry. He didn't know about my personal connection to the situation but couldn't resist sharing the office gossip. Greg had been suspended pending further investigation, and Laura was rumored to be considering leaving the company altogether. It seemed their carefully constructed lives were beginning to crumble. I wasn't done yet. I had one final card to play, a confrontation designed not just to expose Laura but to ensure she couldn't spin her version of events to save face. It wasn't enough for her to lose her job or her reputation at work. I wanted the people closest to her, our friends and family, to see the truth as well. I organized a dinner, framing it as an opportunity for us to clear the air and move forward as a couple. Laura agreed reluctantly, probably hoping to use it as a way to repair her own image. She even put on a performance in the days leading up to it, acting sweeter and more attentive than she had in months. But it was too little, too late. The dinner would be her reckoning. I had everything prepared: printed messages, emails, photos, and a narrative that left no room for ambiguity. It wouldn't just be me confronting her. It would be her facing everyone she'd lied to, everyone she'd manipulated with her excuses and half-truths. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. It was the truth laid bare for everyone to see. And as the day of the dinner approached, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of closure, knowing that soon, the world Laura and Greg had built on lies would finally come crashing down. The night of the dinner was tense from the start. I had invited Laura's parents, her sister and brother-in-law, a few of our closest mutual friends, and even Greg's wife, who was unaware of the true purpose of the evening. On the surface, it seemed like a simple family gathering, a chance to reconnect and smooth over the tension that had built since Laura's confession. But underneath, it was a trap, a carefully orchestrated moment of reckoning. Laura seemed nervous but tried to mask it with a forced smile and overly cheerful small talk. She dressed the part of the dutiful wife, fussing over the table settings and chatting with the guests, likely hoping to portray an image of normalcy. It was ironic, watching her act like everything was fine, knowing that within the hour, I would rip that facade to shreds. The meal began uneventfully. People exchanged polite conversation, catching up on work, kids, and the little dramas that filled their lives. I waited, letting the tension build. Laura, sensing something was off, shot me questioning glances throughout the evening, but I avoided her gaze. I wanted her to feel the anticipation, the unease. It was only fair, given the months of deceit she had put me through. As dessert was being served, I finally made my move. Clearing my throat, I stood and tapped my glass to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent, and I could feel every eye on me. Laura's expression froze, her smile faltering as she realized something was about to happen. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," I began, keeping my tone steady. It's been a tough few months for Laura and me, and I thought it was important to bring the people we care about together to share something significant. Laura's face paled, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her parents exchanged concerned glances, while her sister looked confused. Greg's wife raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of its source. I took a deep breath and continued. I've been struggling with something for a while now, something I've kept to myself. But I believe that the people in this room deserve to know the truth. Reaching behind me, I pulled out the folder I had prepared. It contained everything: printouts of the text messages, screenshots of emails, and even receipts for hotel stays. I placed it on the table and slid it toward Laura, who stared at it as though it were a live grenade. "This," I said, my voice hardening, "is the truth about Laura's relationship with her boss, Greg." The room erupted in confusion. Voices overlapped as people demanded explanations, their shock palpable. Laura's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while her father leaned forward, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Greg's wife sat frozen, her expression blank as the weight of my words sank in. Laura tried to protest, but her voice cracked under the pressure. "James, this isn't." I cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't. I've listened to your lies long enough. Now it's your turn to listen." I opened the folder and began laying out the evidence for everyone to see. I didn't hold back. Every message, every email, every shred of proof was displayed, leaving no room for doubt. I recounted how long the affair had gone on, the lengths they had gone to hide it, and the sheer disregard they had shown for the people they were supposed to care about. The room was silent except for the occasional gasp or muttered curse. Laura's father sat rigid, his face red with anger, while her mother quietly wept. Greg's wife stared at the table, her hands trembling as she processed the betrayal. Our friends looked between Laura and me, their expressions a mix of shock and pity. Laura didn't say a word. For the first time, she seemed truly at a loss. The lies she had built her life on had crumbled, and there was no escaping the truth. When I finished, I turned to the group. I didn't do this to humiliate anyone, but I needed you all to know what really happened. Laura and I are done. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and the divorce papers will be filed soon. As for Greg, I hope this is a wake-up call for everyone who trusted him. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving Laura to face the fallout. The sound of raised voices followed me as I stepped outside, but I didn't look back. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. I had taken control of my life again, and while the pain of betrayal would linger, I knew I was finally free. The days following the dinner felt like the calm after a storm. The chaos I had unleashed at that table spread like wildfire, and I could feel its ripple effects everywhere. Laura didn't come home that night, and I wasn't sure if it was out of shame or defiance. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. I had made my stand, and there was no going back. I moved quickly to secure my independence. The very next morning, I finalized my discussions with the lawyer. She assured me that with the evidence I had, the divorce would be straightforward. There would be no way for Laura to contest it, especially with her reputation in tatters. I updated all my accounts, moving my money to separate accounts and cutting off any joint finances we shared. Anything that tied us together was severed, piece by piece. I also began making arrangements to move out. The house we'd shared was no longer a home. It was a museum of broken promises, each room holding memories I no longer wanted to revisit. I found a small apartment across town, modest but clean, and began packing my things. It felt strange, almost mechanical, as I boxed up my life. I didn't take much, just the essentials and a few personal items that still held meaning to me. Word of what had happened spread quickly, especially within Laura's family and social circle. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out, offering their sympathy or their shock at how things had unfolded. Some of them admitted they had suspected something was off, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Others apologized for not saying anything when they noticed Laura's behavior changing. It was equal parts validating and infuriating to hear. I thanked them, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to let anyone back in, not yet. What surprised me most was Greg's wife. A week after the dinner, she reached out to me. She didn't apologize for Greg's actions, how could she? But she did thank me for bringing the truth to light. She said that she had suspected something for a while but never had the proof or the courage to confront him. I could hear the pain in her voice, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for how publicly everything had played out. But I reminded myself that the blame lay with Laura and Greg, not me. As I settled into my new apartment, I found myself with an uncomfortable amount of free time. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos I had grown used to over the years. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I'd sit on the couch, staring at the walls or mindlessly scrolling through my phone, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost. But slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I hadn't realized were missing. I started going to the gym again, something I'd neglected during my marriage. The physical exertion felt cathartic, a way to channel the anger and frustration that still lingered. I dusted off my old guitar, fumbling through chords and songs I hadn't played in years. It was clumsy at first, but it felt good to create something, even if it was just a mess of sound. I also reconnected with friends I had drifted away from. At first, it was awkward, explaining what had happened and navigating their reactions. But they were supportive, offering a mix of encouragement and distraction that I hadn't realized I needed. One of them invited me to join a weekend hiking group, something I'd never considered before. To my surprise, I enjoyed it. Being out in nature, away from the reminders of my old life, gave me a sense of clarity and perspective. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to the evidence I had. Laura didn't fight it, which made things easier. When the papers were finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was the end of something I had once believed would last forever, but it was also the beginning of something new. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Starting over wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, when the memories threatened to pull me back into the darkness. But I reminded myself of everything I had endured, everything I had overcome. I wasn't the same man I had been when this all started, but maybe that was a good thing. I had learned to stand up for myself, to fight for my own worth, and to let go of the things that no longer served me. Bit by bit, I was rebuilding my life. And while the scars of betrayal would always be there, they no longer defined me. I was moving forward, one step at a time. Months passed, and the intensity of the betrayal began to fade, leaving behind a quieter kind of pain, one that still stung but no longer consumed me. The anger that had fueled me during those first few weeks was gone, replaced by something I couldn't immediately identify. Maybe it was acceptance. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. Either way, I wasn't the same person I had been at the start of this nightmare. I didn't recognize the man I had been then, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Life slowly took on a new rhythm. The apartment, which had once felt so foreign and temporary, started to feel like home. I rearranged the furniture, hung a few photos, and even bought a couple of houseplants. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Everything in that space reflected me, not us, and that brought a quiet sense of pride. I stopped obsessing over Laura and Greg. Their lives were their problem now, not mine. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, Greg lost his job during the HR investigation. His clean-cut family man image had been destroyed, and his wife had left him soon after the dinner. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to be struggling. She had left her job and moved in with her sister, but I didn't ask for details. I had no interest in her suffering. I just wanted her out of my mind. Instead, I focused on myself. I threw myself into new hobbies, hiking, woodworking, and even a cooking class I joined on a whim. I surprised myself by enjoying it, and it became a kind of therapy. I'd spend hours experimenting in the kitchen, not caring if the results were perfect. It was the act of creating, of doing something for myself, that mattered. The hiking group became a constant in my life. Most weekends, we explored trails I'd never known existed, each one a small reminder of how much there was to discover beyond the confines of my old life. The first time I reached the top of a particularly steep climb, I stood there, looking out at the endless stretch of trees and sky, and felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Relationships became simpler. I reconnected with my parents, who had been quietly supportive throughout the ordeal, always offering a listening ear but never prying. I also mended friendships I had let slip during my marriage. It was strange, catching up with people I hadn't seen in years, but it felt good. They reminded me of who I had been before Laura, before everything fell apart. Eventually, I started to think about the future in a way I hadn't before. Not in terms of rebuilding what I'd lost, but in creating something entirely new. I set small goals for myself: save for a trip, finish a woodworking project, run a 5K. Each one, no matter how insignificant it seemed, gave me a sense of purpose. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and it didn't come all at once. For a long time, I couldn't even think about Laura without a bitter taste in my mouth. But as time went on, I realized that holding on to that bitterness only anchored me to the past. Letting go didn't mean excusing her actions, it meant freeing myself from them. Slowly, I allowed myself to release the anger, to stop replaying the what-ifs and if-onlys in my mind. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. The difference was, I could live with mine. One day, I found myself thinking about love again. Not in a desperate, searching way, but as a possibility, a quiet hope for the future. I wasn't ready yet, and that was okay. For now, I was enough. I didn't need someone else to complete me or fix me. I was doing that on my own, piece by piece. The scars of betrayal were still there, faint but present, like the remnants of an old injury that twinged every now and then. But they no longer defined me. They were a part of my story, not the whole of it. In the end, the experience didn't destroy me, it reshaped me. I had found strength I didn't know I had, learned to stand on my own 2 feet, and rediscovered who I was beneath all the layers of hurt and disappointment. Life didn't look the way I thought it would, but maybe that was the point. Maybe it was never supposed to. As I stood on the edge of a quiet trail one afternoon, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. The kind that comes not from forgetting the past but from understanding it. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to find out.